Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started on my presentation, which is all about putting your policies together. This is going to be kind of a review because, we're at the end of this program, so I thought it would be a good time to go back and kind of talk a little bit more about, start at the beginning again, talk about what's in a collection management policy, what's in a collection development policy, and then talk about some of the subjects that we've covered in this workshop series. I will say that I have borrowed many slides from Elise's presentation back at the beginning. She is credited, and I wanted to tell her thank you again for working on the slides because they were great. And I was about to do them all over again, and I realized that she had really good slides that I could reuse. So thanks again to Elise for putting together some slides early on in the program. Okay, so a collections management policy. What is this topic? What is this policy? It's basically a detailed written document approved by the governing authority that specifies the museum's policies concerning all collections related issues. This is kind of our Bible in the museum world when it comes to collections. It's going to be the thing that you refer to. It's going to be the thing that helps you stop taking in donations if you don't want to take them. It's maybe going to help you get rid of objects in your collection if you want to get rid of them. It's kind of our core document. This is one of the core docs. American Alliance of Museums has their core document verification program, which is kind of a baby step on the way to being accredited. This is one of the main documents that you're going to see in that process. So the museum field considers it incredibly important to have this done before you go anywhere near an assessment or an accreditation or anything along that line. So it's kind of that Bible for all of us to use. What do CMPs cover? They cover all these fabulous subjects. They cover the mission and purpose of the museum. I always think it's really important to include the mission of the museum somewhere in your collections management policy, basically because it will show that you guys are all on the same page. I don't think there's anything, I do museum assessments for AAM, I'm an assessor, and I always find it interesting when people give me policies and they don't talk to each other. You can tell they were written in a room and never have come in contact with each other. So I think it's always important that you refer back to other policies and you refer back to the mission of the museum itself whenever you can. There's going to be a description of collections in that document. You're going to have methods of acquiring objects, methods of disposing of objects, your loan policies, handling objects left in the institution's custody, your care and control of collections, access, security insurance, and records related to collections activities. This is basically your essential outline to a collections management policy. When it comes to libraries and archives, the document that most likely kind of like is our sister document in their world is called the collections development policy. Sometimes you'll see it in one document, sometimes you'll see it in a couple separate documents. It just kind of depends on the institution. It's a detailed written document that establishes standards that regulate the library or archives collections related activities. So again, how you manage the collection, what you do with it. Oftentimes, in this program, we've looked at the libraries and archives who have joined us are more the special collections for the libraries, not the overall library. There probably will be an overall library collection development policy, and then the archives or the special collections will also have a separate one that detail what they do, and they're part of the library system. What does it cover? Purpose of the library or archive, a background statement, again, giving it kind of that place in the universe. Your target audience. Now that is one thing that I find interesting between a collections management policy, what we use in the museum world, is usually we don't really talk about audiences a whole heck of a lot. And I think maybe that's something we might want to borrow in the future from the libraries and archives. Evaluative criteria, format statement, method of acquiring, that sounds like what we do. Special collections, the weeding statement, how you get rid of stuff. Resource sharing, care and control of collections, access to collections, and security insurance. So there's some things that you can do direct parallels. There's some things that you don't see in each other's documents, and I honestly think there's things that we can borrow from each other's documents that I think will make stronger policies in the long run. So the difference, we kind of talked about that a little bit already. When it comes to museums, the strict policy regulations to the CMP guide the deaccession or disposal of collections. I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more when we get to that section, but we take that subject in the museum world very seriously when it comes to getting rid of stuff. It's also the highest level of the museum's governing authority and must approve the deaccession and disposal of collections. When it comes to libraries and archives, the policy regulations in the CDP guide the weeding of the collections, so still the same idea. And the librarian is in charge of the collections to make decisions. So again, those are some things that you're going to see that are slight differences between the two documents. So after that quick review, I'm going to go ahead and go through kind of just the different sections that we've discussed in this session or in these different sessions. Our first module, all the way back in December, it feels like, covered 4 different subjects that you're going to find in a CMP or a CDP. The first thing was the guiding documents, which we just kind of discussed a little bit, that Elise did back at the beginning of the actual workshop series. The first big section of your collections management or collections policy, just kind of more generalized, is to include a scope of collections and categories of collections. Now, this topic can get hairy because you have to sit there and figure out what actually do your collections consist of. Some people know right away. Other people will not be so sure. So you have to really get an idea of what is considered in your collection and what you have in it. So it's basically a thorough scope of collections, describes the history of the collection as well as current collection categories. Main points include the importance of the history of the collection. The history of the collection, I think, is something that you have to include. A lot of people will sit there and say, well, we don't really need to include where this collection started from. But I always think, you know, if we have new people coming in or a new intern, or you've been the collections person for 15 years and then you, I hate the term, but get hit by a bus one day and then a new person comes in, they're not going to have any of this institutional history in their head. So it's incredibly important that it's written down and kept somewhere. It also is important in this section to include an examination of the strengths and weaknesses of your collection. It's okay to kind of sit there and say, we have a lot of this stuff. We don't really need any more of it. We maybe need some more of this stuff because our mission actually lists this. That happens a lot. You'll look at the mission statement of the institution, say, we are really interested in the history of Florida and its agricultural practices, to use an example here, including the cattle industry. And then you look at your museum collections. This is not from the institution I'm talking about, but let's say you look at your collection and go, we have nothing about the cattle industry. So then you realize, okay, that's a weakness. We got to start collecting in that area. And you can also list your types of collections that can be found in the museum's archives or special collections. Again, going back to that concept, types of collections can span the gamut. You can sit there and say we have permanent collections and education collections and exhibitory collection. That's it. Other people will get very detailed. We have permanent textile collections. We have permanent object collections. We have a permanent archaeological collection. It kind of works with however it works for your institution, and you get to decide as the collections person how you want to separate out your collections. I think that's an important fact that people forget. You get to decide this fact. You get to sit there and look at your breadth of your collection and say, okay, what are the categories that make sense? Next section was acquisitions, accessions, deaccessions, and disposals. This topic covered proper methods of acquiring and bringing objects properly into the collection. So do you purchase objects? Do you do donations? How do you accept donations? Once you get them into the collection, how do you process them? Who is the person who signs off on acquiring that object? All those little bits and pieces that might be interesting. Then the other side of that is the proper methods of disposing and removing objects from the collection. As we stated before, there's that weeding concept that libraries do that I'm always jealous of the weeding concept, because in a way, weeding is just, and you know, correct me, library folks, if I get this kind of muddled, but basically you can go through the collection and get rid of stuff pretty easily. Like you can sit there and say, okay, we don't need this anymore, it's damaged. You have to go through a process, but it's not a huge deal. When it comes to museums, we usually need to get someone to sign off on the fact that we're getting rid of this thing. And then if for some reason it is sold, the money that we use from those objects is under pretty strict, this is what you have to do with the money. It either needs to go towards, pretty much it's direct care of collections. You're either going to conservation treatments, possibly buying new objects in the collections. And in my view, that should be about it. I think sometimes there is a gray area where funds can be used to maybe help with collection storage areas, helping with HVAC systems, that kind of a thing. But as the grayer it gets, you don't want to end up paying for a new building that holds collection storage and a bunch of stuff that's not related to collections. It can get a little scary. So it's something to consider. One thing when it comes to using the funds, AAM released a direct care, a white paper, basically about 2 years ago, which everyone chimed in on. It was actually a really great document because library folks joined in on it, archive folks joined in on it, zoos and aquariums joined in on it, and they had their say about what you can use for funds and what you should use, what everyone feels is appropriate. So if you'd like to read that, let me know, and I can send you guys a direct link to that actual paper. And our little quickie webinar for that module was Found in Collections Abandoned Property, where I got to sit there and go through the law with you all and talk about what our fabulous Florida statute 265.565 actually talks about, what we can do with abandoned property in this state. We also talked about some ideas and ways people handle found in collection items, which can be sticky too. A lot of people have found in collection, which you guys know is basically objects that when you walk in, you kind of find a bunch of stuff in your collection and there's no paperwork and you got to take care of it. So we talked about some strategies people could use when it comes to that. Our second module covered loans, documentation, inventory, and audits. For loans, they're the one way that museums, library, archives, and zoos can meet their responsibility to share information, educate the public. We spoke about incoming and outgoing loans, loans from peer-to-peer organizations, and individuals. So all the different kind of loans people can see. That topic's very interesting to me because, in the museum world, loaning is kind of a big process. For libraries, it's also a big process, but they also have the concept of interlibrary loans, which is what they tend to hear a little bit more. But it also opened the discussion to how a lot of libraries are starting to do exhibitions and exhibits, and they have to fill out and do kind of what we consider pretty standard museum loan paperwork. So I think it was a pretty good introduction on how our different institutions handle loans. We then went on to talk about documentation because, as I've always said, we collections folks, we like to kill trees. We still like our paper. So we talked about all the different forms of paper that we can use in our collections. We talked about accession forms, documentation forms. Stephanie did a really good overview on all the different types of forms that you can use throughout archives and museums. So that was a great topic. Then we rounded out that webinar talking about inventory and audits. We all kind of have to deal with inventory, and basically they demonstrate the accountability of museums, archives, and zoos to their collections and constituents. We talked about the purpose of them, the establishment of timeline, complete inventories versus partial inventories, methods of conducting inventories, documentation and preparation for inventories. And we got some good real world examples of how people do inventories. And I'll say right now that there's going to be a session at FAM this year also talking about inventories. So if you want to do a deep dive in the subject, make sure to come to FAM and you can get even more information on it. And our quick webinar for that one was actually about insurance and risk management. We had two speakers from the insurance field, one who actually is based kind of in Florida, another one who was more nationwide, who spoke about different types of insurance coverage. The one speaker spoke about insurance and what kind of coverage you should look for, what kind of coverage you can get. And then the other speaker spoke a bit about insurance after the effect, how it handles. And he had some really good case studies talking about how the insurance industry changed after things like Hurricane Sandy came through, how Hurricane Katrina, and how the insurance agency actually reacted to it. We also have some older webinars in case you want to do a little bit more of a deep dive on that subject, talking about from a museum point of view and an archival type of view, what kind of insurance coverage you should have. So if you want those are located on our FAM YouTube channel. And our next section was about access, use, collections, care, and intellectual property. For access and use, we did a description of formal policies about access to objects, the catalog information, identify audiences or users and guidelines, and reproductions and digital copies. We looked at resource sharing, services provided, and how people get into our collections and access them, and how, again, we like forms, so the different types of forms that people like to use. Collections, care, and maintenance, we had some speakers from, again, both the collections field and the archives field, talking about the standards for each type of institution should establish in terms of care for their objects and their respective collections. We spoke about a little bit about disaster preparedness, binding, preservation, conservation, all the things that people kind of have to have in their mind when it comes to collections care. And finally, we rounded out that topic with intellectual property, which was dense but really informative. And I really enjoyed hearing those topics where they spoke about kind of policy standards that encompass intellectual property for each type of institution, and a discussion of fair use standards, which is incredibly important in our world, because I know we've all been in the place where we've had exhibit folk or other marketing folk come to us and say, we want to put this on a coffee mug, and then we have to sit there and figure out, okay, can you put said thing on a coffee mug? I think museums and libraries, people like tchotchkes, people like handouts, and it's kind of our world to try to figure out, do we have the right to make said things into tchotchkes and ephemera that can be used? So it was really interesting to hear that. For that particular topic too, I was always also very interested in hearing some folks talk about the use of movies and stuff in their institutions. So you can go back and listen to that webinar if you want, but as we look at our libraries are much better at this topic, but when you look at museums and stuff opening up their facilities to show movies and to do public viewings of different objects, I think learning about that fair use and intellectual property is incredibly important, and it's something you do need to include in your policy. Our webinar for that topic was digitization. We had John Nemmers from UF speak about that. He talked about standards and resources you can use with digitization projects. It was very interesting. Digitization projects are still getting funded, amazingly enough. I know I saw some grant announcements lately for some institutions that have gotten some funding when it comes to digitization. So getting a good idea of what kind of standards people are using, who to contact, because there's a lot of information out there on digitization. So if I know I can go contact the people at UF to find out what is the current standard, I'd rather do that than read a website for 3 hours and try to discern what the heck the proper file format is. So it was a very informative webinar on that point. And that brings us to today. Today we've been learning a little bit about educating elected officials, which, while not part of your policy, is something that you need to think about. And I think it's okay to think about, okay, we've put together this policy. This is a topic that should be included and kind of in the back of our mind as we work on our policy. We're doing this quick session about putting your policy together. And this afternoon, which should actually be a formal part of your policy, we're going to talk about training and practical applications. We'll go into this a bit more later this afternoon, like I said, but you do need to have a section in your policy that talks about training and talks about, okay, this is what we're going to do for training of our policy to interns, staff, anyone who comes in contact. So it's incredibly important to include that section in your policy. And then later on, we will be doing another mid-module little webinar at the end of it, where you guys get to choose between sustainability or code of ethics, two things that you also do kind of need to include as a section of your policy. So it should be pretty interesting to see what you all decide to include. So with that, that's pretty much a quick review, a speedy, quick review of all the different topics we've covered and what we've done in our policy. I'm going to earn this workshop series. I'm going to go ahead and check in with our friends in Miami to see if anyone has any questions or any comments about the topics that we've covered, or if they think there's something they would like to see included in the future or something we've missed. So if you want to hop on the mic to let us know, it would be appreciated.
Nope, we're good.
Excellent. And then I'm going to check in with our friends up in Gainesville to see if they have any comments or anything we think we have missed in the workshop series.
We're trying to decide if we have any questions now.
Okay. I will say, I know this is while they're deciding to see if they have any questions. It does seem like a lot.
We're good, sorry.
No worries. It's a lot, writing policies and plans, it takes a while, you know what I mean? It just does, but hopefully we've broken it up enough so that people could take bites of it while they could and within their time frame.